So guys, if you're just joining us, it's Dr. Mo here from Inspire Medics. We're starting slightly later than usual. We were supposed to start for 7 p.m., but we had a PLAB international webinar with about 100 attendees and 3 guest speakers. So we slightly overshot that first one. But welcome to everybody. It's Dr. Mo here from Inspire Medics. Today's teaching will be on cervical screening, which the guidelines have changed for very, very recently. And Dr. Sandhu will also be talking about miscarriages and the information that you know both for the AKT, the MSRA and the RCA exam. If you are joining us, if you don't mind, there is a chat icon down at the bottom of Zoom. Inside the chat icon, what you can do is just, let us know where you're joining us from in the country, and of course which exam you're sitting, so we roughly know which exam you're preparing for. I can see there are 39 attendees so far, so if you don't mind typing into the chat box, and we'll start doing shout outs very soon, just whilst I get this live stream to the Facebook groups. So Vikas, if you
Perfect. Welcome, guys. We've just literally come off an international webinar, which is why we're 2 or 3 minutes late. So we've finished that. We had some guest speakers on that. So now it's time to get down to the nitty gritty of the teaching. So 41 people are logged in already. So welcome. You know what we normally do, guys, how we normally start, which is whereabouts in the country are you and which exam are you preparing for? So we've got Abraham Thomas from Peterborough preparing for the AKT exam. We've got Funmi from Nottingham preparing for the MSRA, which is of course the GP entrance exam. Ash from Staffordshire preparing for AKT. Oliver Tusin from Preston preparing for the AKT. Ola is preparing for the RCA exam from Cambridge. Tolu's from Birmingham. Funmi from Nottingham for the MSRA. Rashid is preparing for the AKT exam. Tolu from Birmingham is preparing for the AKT exam. So keep your shout outs coming in. So we always like to start off the kind of free webinars that we do, the teaching webinars, with a quick shout out to some of you guys, where you're from and which deanery you're from. So Napoleon is from Wales, preparing for the RCA. Sardia from Wirral, preparing for the RCA as well. So there's a good variety actually in the audience today. Some of you are going for the RCA, some of you for the AKT, and some of you are at the beginning, so you're applying for GP training for the MSRA and preparing for the MSRA exam. So good stuff. So Dr. Mo streaming live now to the Inspire Medics AKT, RCA and MSRA revision group. So if you're joining us from Facebook, welcome. If you do have any questions, we will keep an eye on the Facebook group. And we will obviously answer them as we go along. For the guys who are joining us, there's 47 now, so I can see lots of people joining. Selma from Yorkshire preparing for the AKT. Welcome, Selma. Use the Q&A button, guys, if you've got any questions throughout the webinar. We will be talking about the latest NICE guidelines, and today we've got a gynecology feel to the webinars. You probably have got the format by now. It's normally kind of straight to the point, relevant, focused learning. Dr. Mo is going to talk about cervical screening with the updates from the current NICE guidance, and then I'll give you an overview about miscarriage as well. And of course, we'll let you know about what kind of things we're doing as well to help you with your revision, depending on which exam you are preparing for. So without further ado, I will get Dr. Mo to take over, and we'll take it from there.
Okay, guys, welcome to today's free webinar. We appreciate you taking your time out. We have looked into these topics to make sure they're up to date with the latest guidelines, and we appreciate, of course, you're sitting exams which might be coming very, very soon, which is AKT, RCA and MSRA. So if you haven't joined us for these webinars before, what we do is we try and teach you 3 key learning points for each topic, and those 3 key learning points are the most important learning points. Those are the most important learning points for the topics that are most likely to come up in an exam or a RCA setting, for example, that you're likely to be tested on. So I'm going to start off actually by this briefly covering the old guidelines for cervical screening first, because if you're not aware of this, the cervical screening guidelines changed recently, and the old guidelines used to be based on the cell cytology, whether or not it was borderline, low grade, high grade, and so on and so forth. But there have been some fundamental changes now to the cervical screening program, which actually caught us slightly by surprise when they were released, because we had to update all the question banks on our system. But I think it's very, very important that you're aware of this. So as always, we always go through a recap first, just to bring you a flavor of what you should already know, and then we'll move on to the latest guidelines. So cervical screening is, of course, a UK based program which allows the early detection of cervical cancer. And the statistics are quite remarkable. So it saves on average 4,500 lives each year. And globally, cervical cancer is the 4th most common cancer in the world. In terms of who gets invited, so it's important to know, especially for the AKT exam, that the first invitations are sent out to women when they're roughly 24, well, they are 24 years and 6 months old. So it's before their 25th birthday. And the reason for that is because the invitation should have gone out to allow the woman to attend by the time she gets to 25. But once a woman gets to 25 and between the ages of 25 to 49, the cervical screening program takes place every 3 years. Now, for your information, there is some talks about changing that to every 5 years in women who essentially have normal cervical smears. But that is something that's still in the pipelines. But for now, for the purpose of your exam, between the ages of 25 to 49, women are screened for their cervical screening every 3 years. Now, once a woman starts to get older, the rate of turnover of the cells in the cervical area tends to slow down. And it's less likely that those cells will end up becoming cancerous. And therefore, the cervical screening program is done every 5 years between the ages of 50 and 64. Now, you can still get a cervical screen done over the age of 65 or above, but there has to be specific reasons for that. And the current reasons, which are mentioned in the NICE guidelines, are if a recent cervical cytology sample has come back abnormal. So, for example, if they were 64 and they turned 65 and the results came out when they were 65, that would apply. Or if they've not had a cervical screen since they were 50 years of age and the woman actually comes in to request one. So if a female is, let's say, 68 years old, she's not had one since she was 50, and she says, well, actually, I'd like to go for a cervical screen. At that point, you can offer it under the National Health Service cervical screening program. If a woman wants a cervical screen done outside of the limitations or the guidelines of the NICE guidance, then of course you can signpost to private cervical screening services, or potentially you can get in touch with the CCG and ask if it may be warranted in a certain situation. Because remember, these are guidelines and there may be circumstances where you need to request for cervical screening outside of those guidelines. But this is a recap in terms of the information you should know. Now let's move on to the information you do need to know for the purposes of the exams that you're sitting. So what's changed? Now, if you remember from, let's go back 4 years, whenever a cervical screen was done, the first thing that was done was the cytology was done first, and the cytology would be broken down into various categories. So borderline, normal, low grade, high grade, and so on and so forth. And the biggest fundamental change which has now occurred is that the cervical screen sample that gets taken is initially tested for HPV. That's the very first thing that happens in the lab. And then depending on the results will depend on what happens next to the sample, and obviously the journey through which the woman would go through clinically. So cervical screening is done, let's say in the clinic or the hospital for whatever reason. Samples are sent to the lab. First thing that the lab does is that they test it for HPV. Now, if it's HPV negative, then no further cytology, cervical cytology occurs, i.e. they don't look at the cells under a microscope, and the woman goes back to the normal cervical screening recall. And as we've explained, that could be the 3-year or the 5-year recall. And that's very different to what used to go on before. So before, obviously, depending on your results in terms of the cytology, they would then test for HPV, and from there they would then decide what to do next. Now the reverse is applied, and I'll come on to the reasons why very, very soon. So first key learning point: the cervical screening samples that are taken are initially tested for HPV, and if they're negative, no further action is taken. The cells are not observed under a microscope, and the woman goes straight back to the normal recall. However, if the samples that are taken from the cervical screening are positive for HPV, and that can be any HPV, it doesn't have to be a high risk group, which we're going to come on to later. So, for example, high risk types are 16 and 18. Any HPV that comes back positive within the sample, then the cells are sent off for cytology. So we're going to cover this pathway now in our second learning point. So let's assume a female has had cervical screening done. She's had the initial HPV test done and it's come back positive. The cells are going to be sent off for cytology. Now, if those cells come back normal, then the female is rescreened under the cervical screening program after 12 months. That's very, very important to know. She's HPV positive. She's had a cytology done. The cytology's come back normal. Therefore, she's going to be rescreened in 12 months. However, if the cytology sample under the microscope comes back abnormal, and abnormal is classified as borderline, low grade, high grade, invasive or glandular neoplasia, then the woman is immediately referred for colposcopy. And as you might remember from your previous guidelines, if it was borderline, usually the guidelines will say between, for example, 4 to 6 weeks that you could refer, but now it doesn't matter. Any abnormality whatsoever that's picked up on the cytology is an immediate referral to colposcopy. And in terms of the logistics, the cervical screening lab will actually handle all the referrals. So you'll get the results. They would have already actioned the results for you on your behalf, and the woman will automatically get a letter for colposcopy in the post. But it's important to know, obviously, what happens. Now, a lot of doctors will have a question, well, what happens after the woman's been rescreened after 12 months? Now, of course, this is important to understand. It's unlikely to be an AKT or an MSRA question, simply because you're starting to go into the third, fourth, and fifth step of the algorithm in terms of what to do, but you should have an understanding of it. So if the initial HPV sample is positive and the cytology remains normal, then you rescreen every 12 months for 3 consecutive cycles. And if all of those samples are HPV positive, but the cytology is normal, then you refer on for colposcopy. I'll just repeat that in case that didn't make any sense. Let's say you did a cervical screen and it came back HPV positive, and the sample went off to cytology, and the cytology was normal. So you rescreen the woman after 12 months and it comes back HPV positive again, but the cytology is normal. You rescreen again after 12 months. Once you've tested the sample 3 times for HPV and it's come back positive, but the cytology has come back normal, then you can refer to colposcopy. And the NICE guidelines is quite clear for that. However, if at any point in that journey, the cytology sample is abnormal, so let's say you've rescreened after 12 months, HPV positive again, but then the cytology is abnormal, then you would refer for colposcopy. But of course, if any point in this journey over here, the top part, it becomes HPV negative, then it goes back into the normal cervical screening recall program. So I'll come back onto this in a moment, but once you've got your head around it, it's relatively easy to remember and also to understand. So just touching on this again, negative, of course, if you do cervical cytology, if it's negative, that means no abnormality is detected and the woman goes back into the normal cervical screening program. Abnormal covers a wide range of cytology results, including borderline, low grade, high grade, which would be broken down into moderate and severe, invasive squamous cell carcinoma, and of course, glandular neoplasia. And if a woman has any evidence of abnormal cytology following on from a HPV positive test, she would be referred immediately for colposcopy. And then, of course, the third key learning point here is the HPV types. It's a very, very common AKT question, sometimes comes up in the MSRA exam, and of course it can sometimes come up in a RCA/CSA setting. So the 16 and the 18 are the high risk types in terms of HPV, and those are the common ones that most people are aware of. But there are 16 other, if my maths is correct, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Altogether, I think there's 16, 15 or 16 other HPV types that fall under high risk groups. And those are 31, 33, 35, 39, 45, 51, 52, 56, 58, 59, 68, 73, and 82. Now, you don't need to memorize these because these are unlikely to be tested in the exam. But by all means, you should definitely be memorizing 16 and 18. And those are the ones. So when we say high risk HPV types, these are the This is the type of HPV virus which is most likely to cause changes in the cervical cells, which then lead on to cancerous changes. And that's why they're important to remember for the exam. So just to recap, a couple of things. First key learning point, which is a recap, is to know when women are invited to the cervical screening program and how often the recall is done depending on the age categorization. Learning point number 2 is that the cervical screen sample that's taken is initially tested for HPV. Depending on what's found, if it's negative, the woman goes back to the normal recall. If it's positive, then the sample has cytology done on it. Depending on the cytology results, if the cytology results are at any point abnormal, then the woman gets referred to colposcopy. However, if the cytology sample is normal after having a HPV positive test, then the woman gets called back to the screening program after 12 months. And that occurs every 12 months with the positive HPV sample, which are with a normal cytology. And then if that occurs 3 times in a row, then the woman gets referred for colposcopy automatically, even though all 3 12-monthly samples for the cytology were absolutely normal, but she was still obviously HPV positive. If at any point in that cycle she's HPV negative, then she goes back into the normal recall. And then finally, of course, we covered what abnormal means, which is the third key learning point. You don't really need to memorize these anymore because the initial tests are to do with HPV testing. And of course, if it's abnormal or normal, which is kind of simplified things. And finally, the third key learning point here is that HPV 16 and 18 are the high-risk groups, but there are other high-risk groups you need to be aware of in case you get caught out with an exam question, which will be a bit unfair. But of course, as I mentioned, the first bullet point here is the one to memorize. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to, we've covered 3 key learning points. We're just going to mention, we're going to answer some questions, which we're going to come on to shortly, give you some thinking time to do that. But we're going to bounce out and give you some key pieces of information in terms of some of the products we have available on our website, which you might find useful. So the first thing is, if you haven't subscribed to our free AKT question bank, you can of course do that. We've got almost 3,000, if not 3,000 questions altogether. It doesn't cost you anything. And we highly recommend subscribing for that and the MSRA free question bank. So the MSRA question bank now has over 200 SJTs, which you can of course use to prepare for the actual exam. For the AKT and the MSRA products, you can of course just go for the free packages, but we generally recommend, if you want to prepare thoroughly, for the gold package. So the gold package has 750 podcasts, it has 750 videos, and it has 750 additional MCQs as well. So you get a bonus 750 MCQs. And of course, we also send out free flashcards to your home address. So have a look at the packages and of course, subscribe to the one that's most appropriate for you. The other key, Dr. Sandu will put this into the chat box, is we have a iMedics forum section. So if you want to discuss AKT topics, latest guidelines, if you want to discuss MSRA topics, SJT tips, you can do that within our forum. And already you can see doctors are chatting about different topics. So which one is easier, RCA or CSA? Exam preparation tips for AKT. Dr. Tabish Shah has posted into that. And you can see lots of different countries, doctors from different countries already posting into this forum, and you can pick out which topic is relevant for you, and please by all means post into it. Now, if your AKT exam is coming up very, very soon, we'd highly recommend booking in for the AKT mock, which is really competitively priced. It's only $99.99. We've got a discount on it, so the next one's on the 18th of April 2021, before the next AKT sitting, and it's a three-hour big mock. I think it's 3 hours and 10 minutes from the top of my head, in terms of the latest timing from the RCGP. And we do the mock, and then we do a 1 hour lunch break, and then we do 6 hours of latest NICE guidelines, just the way we've done it in the free webinar, but a lot more in detail in terms of relevance to the questions that we ask. And we've got stats in there, and we've got the admin section in there as well. So you'll be given lots of information with regards to key equations you need to know for the exam. It's one of the best priced AKT mocks out there. You'll learn so much. And actually, it'll be the best $99.99 you would have spent on any AKT revision material you're going to use. So by all means, guys, please subscribe to this, book yourself in, and Dr. Sandu will put in the link shortly. And then if you're preparing for the RCA exam, quick show of hands, who's preparing for the RCA exam very soon? Just raise your hand. There's a button in Zoom. You can just raise your hand in the chat feature, And we've got 2 hands gone up. Just raise your hand, 3 hands. Okay, we've got a advanced RCA communication skills course coming up on the 14th of February in 2 weeks time, and the 28th of March as well. Again, it's a full day course. It's going to be the best $49.99 you've spent. I mean, it's extremely high value, and we'll do a full day course talking about advanced communication skills broken down into 5 key high yield areas with 5 live demos done. So we do 5 actual mock cases on the day as well, which you can role play with us. So again, it's a no-brainer, extremely cost effective, and it's worth booking into that if you're unsure about your preparation for the RCA exam. And you will learn so much. I mean, there's basic communication skills, which we understand you all learn as junior doctors, but we're only covering advanced communication skills, stuff like angry patients, shared management, how to properly do ICE, how to give results and score top marks, how to obviously break bad news. So all the key scenarios which they're expecting to see in the real recordings that you're going to submit, including women's health, we cover all of that. So